It was surely a long family tradition, a recipe passed down from great-great-grandma to great-great-grandma to great-grandma to just good old grandma, who is still great to me. Who knows, maybe the recipe traveled across the ocean inside a trunk, got lost over the years, and was rediscovered in some attic, found again just waiting right there on the page to be made to come to life again. Whatever the story was, I wanted to know it. How this Swedish kringla, this simple pastry in a figure eight, not too sweet, of course, lest we be indulgent, but warm and homey and familiar, a dough that coats your soul like a quilt filled with family stories. So I asked, Grandma, can you teach me how to make kringla, the kind you always had in the kitchen at your house in Story City before you moved? I'd love to learn how to make it and to hear how you learned to make it. And she paused and said, well, sure, I suppose we could try. And I was a bit surprised by her choosing of the word try. She said, I've just never made a good batch. It always fell apart or was overdone or dry. I would always undermix or overmix. I couldn't get the ends to stick together. I couldn't get the moisture to stay in. I said, but Grandma, it was always in the kitchen at the house in Story City. And she said, that's true. And you know why? Story City has a Swedish bakery. So what I learned from Grandma is baking is hard. Even if it sounds easy, a stick of butter, a little bit of sugar, an egg, vanilla, flour, baking powder, salt, buttermilk. Add the baking soda to the buttermilk when the butter and sugar are mixing. Add 3 cups of flour, gradually cover, chill overnight, cut into small squares, roll into lines, shape into figure eights, bake at 375 for 10 to 11 minutes till they're brown. Take out of the oven, put in between 2 damp cloths to keep them moist. Put them in a container before you dry them out. At least that's what works for us, the recipe said at the bottom. And for years it had worked. But you know that there are nuances that bakers have used over the years that are not in the recipe. It's dependent on the oven, on the humidity in the room, and the time of year that you're baking it. It's different from the ways that hands press the dough together because of changes in strength or the stress of the day. And the height of the rack, the dampness of the cloth, the measure of the flour on the place where you roll them out in the palm, and how the lines are rolled, even or not. It all takes time and skill and patience to form and then to reform the dough to make it just right in every new context, taking into consideration all the little changes around you. Sometimes stories come down, pass through, and I'm not even joking, Story City, Iowa, and things morph and change, and context shifts, and we make our way in a changed and a changing world with our changed and our changing selves, always unfolding, never finished, always on the way, on the road, toward a life that is always in the process of becoming. Poet Stanley Kunitz writes it this way: I have walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I am not who I was, though some principle of being abides, from which I struggle not to stray. But when I look behind, as I am compelled to look, because I can gather strength to proceed on my journey, I see the milestones dwindling in the horizon, the slow fires trailing from the abandoned campsites over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. Oh, I have made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends who fell along the way bitterly stings my face. Yet I turn, exulting somewhat, with my will intact to go whatever and wherever I need to go. Every stone on the road becomes precious to me. In my darkest night, when the moon was covered and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbus-clouded voice directed me. Live in the layers, not in the litter. Though I lack the art to decipher it, he writes, no doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written, but I'm not done with my changes. I'm not done, he writes, with my changes. Not done with roaming through the wreckage, deciphering and doubting the next chapter in this book of transformations. where one story ends and another begins, another generation, or even the same person or place in just a different moment in time, pick up where the story was left off and add in their own approach, shifting ever so slightly over time and practice how things are done, what seems right in the moment, what seems normative now. We live in the layers of who we have been, who we are yet to become, forming and reforming lives and stories, those recipes of how to live and how to breathe and how to bake from one heart to another. Ecclesia semper reformanda est, wrote theologian Karl Barth about the work of Augustine, the central influence, and the friend of my little friend Marty here, Martin Luther. Ecclesia semper reformanda est means the church must always be reforming, always and forever reforming. So 500 years ago this past Wednesday, Martin Luther walked up to the Castle Church in Wittenberg, where he was a professor of the Hebrew Bible, and the story goes he nailed his 95 theses, his beliefs about how the church must change, right to the front door. But you know what? That's not exactly how it happened. Because when future generations spoke of the impact of that moment, that story, like any good fish story in Minnesota, expanded beyond reality. There was no hammer, there was no nail, no dramatic moment. It was never meant to start a revolution or a reformation, but it was a regular practice of the day, about academic debate among scholars, about current practices in the church. This place, this door, was like a community bulletin board at the local coffee shop, inviting people into discussion. But granted, the hammer, the nail, it's a much better story. Probably wouldn't have lived on in quite the same way. Luther was a complicated individual, and it's not very often that I'll talk about all of these old doctrinal ideas, but it's 500 years, so just give me a break today. And I won't talk about it again for another 500 years. But the impact of those writings were significant, and we join with many other traditions who found their place from the Reformation by noticing and naming the legacy of what 500 years has brought. Because Unitarianism and Universalism were both born out of the Reformation, and in particular the radical fringe of the Radical Reformation, a time when the stronghold practices of the church were being questioned, being challenged, and our traditions trace their roots back to that Reformation spirit, both in content and in practice. Now, much of the beliefs of the Reformation, if you've gone back to read some of the writings of Luther or others, would be highly questionable today among religious liberals, especially Unitarian Universalists. But there are some major teachings of the Reformation that we still practice, and we still believe in some formed and reformed way that we know in our religious tradition as true. So Radical Reformation teaching number 1, the condemnation of the treasury of merit and the selling of indulgences. Or in other words, a critique of the church's practice that encouraged people to pay away their sins, to reduce through convenient payment plans their time in eternal fire and damnation. A marketing phrase from church leader Johann Tetzel in Luther's day was, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, another soul from purgatory springs." So that's this year's pledge theme here at First Church. We'll celebrate 500 years with immense giving. So Luther's rebuttal was this: simul justus et peccator, or sola gratia, or in other words, a human is at the same time, in his words, both a sinner and a saint. It is through grace, not through buying or earning your worth, your dignity. It's grace. It's just you are named and known as beloved, accepted as you are. The Radical Reformation rebuttal to that paying away your sins was the idea of grace, which is the namesake of this congregation, Grace Church here in Rochester for many years, celebrating the universalist message that all people are beloved even in their imperfection, that you can't buy or earn your worth, your dignity, that you are beloved as you are, imperfect and fallible. Your dignity is inherent, intrinsic. You can't earn it. You're born with it. Like the reading that Beth shared with us this morning, each hair and trespass it held fell like pigeon feathers onto the floor, or swept away at the end of the day. This change in foundation, that all was not, as Luther wrote, health but healing, that we are on a way toward wholeness, a process of becoming on the road, this process, this sense of movement. The belief roots a community, a person in foundations of the graceful ease of a soul who's not tangled up in guilt and in shame. That's the universalist part of the Radical Reformation. When you're not worried about paying to get your worth and dignity, if you're not dependent to earn your sense of belovedness or worthiness, that brings a shame-filled soul to a sense of lightness, that you can move again. You're not tangled by shame and guilt. It allows for more joy and more compassion, more gratitude for the beauty of the world that draws the focus out of the self and into the community. If your time is tangled up trying to make up for being human, there's a lot less joy and a lot less compassion that you can bring into the world. Radical Reformation teaching number 2, or in other words, the priesthood of all believers. The belief that people going around and across time, through class and status, have worth and dignity in their work in the world. So beyond just the sense of the soul, their actual work in the world is of equal value and status. Luther wrote in 1520, "There is no difference between lay workers in the community and priests and princes and bishops and popes. They are all of the spiritual estate," he said. "A cobbler, a smith, a peasant, each has the work and office of their trade. They are all consecrated. Every type of work is beneficial to the welfare of the community." So the Radical Reformation rebuttal to the nobility of those leading the church was to lift up the dignity of all types of work, a deeply universalist belief that beyond status and occupation, identity in the community, John Updike writes, is that in the church we're given our real value, the sole unit of one between all people, this nominal arithmetic of equality, he says. 1 equals 1. And a third teaching of the Radical Reformation, as natural from the first two, this natural outcome, is that when you don't spend your life in fear for your soul and your eternal salvation, the third teaching is to love your neighbor. You're freed to love your neighbor. The teaching goes much further back, in fact, to Christianity and the teachings of Jesus, to Judaism, to teachings around the globe, around world religions, the sense of love your neighbor, the golden rule, the platinum rule. But the Reformers cast it in a different key, in light of a corrupt church that was picking the pocket of the poor, driving the gap between the elite and the peasants further and further apart. Luther said, "You are a free person, subject to nobody. You don't have to earn your worth. But at the same time, you are a dutiful servant of the community. You're subject to everyone." Or in other words, all people are beloved. You don't have to spend your time paying for your worth and dignity. So that frees you to love your neighbor. That our well-being is tied together. It's what Martin Luther King called the network of mutuality. So the core teaching, 500 years later, that Unitarian Universalism still draws on from the Reformation is Ecclesia semper reformanda est. The church must always be reforming, changing to new contexts, learning from new sources and teachers and practices. That's what we are about. Not change just because we're uncomfortable with past teachings or certain words or practices, and not change just for the sake of change itself, but we're given a recipe of how to live a life of meaning and ethics and justice, and we adapt it and we change it over time. The spirit of it stays alive throughout, and the story changes, but we add a pinch of this, a teaspoon of that, we adjust the temperature, and we feel it in our own hands, our own hearts, our own bodies and lived experience, and we know that what worked in a different time, in a different context, with different hands, the dough just doesn't rise or stretch or form the same way anymore. So we take what we've been given, find our own finesse, we form and we reform again and again the stories and the words and the teachings to find what works, what it will be just right when something will come out that still smells and tastes like home and nourishment, but looks completely different. "I have walked through many lives," the poet says. I look behind to gather strength for where I'm going. I live in the layers. We are a layered people, as individuals, as a church, as a tradition, and it is true there is a lot of litter along the way, too. A lot to disparage, a lot to critique, a lot to cast aside and throw out, but there's also a lot to dust off and find again, and see, to just wonder if it might still sing in a new key. We are a layered people. Like the opening hymn that we sang today, a tune originated in the time of the Reformation, the 1500s, then words written 100 years later, words written 300 years later, and words written just this year about the mission of this very church. And the hymn we'll sing in a moment, a familiar tune perhaps to some, written by Martin Luther, A Mighty Fortress, was set to new words many years ago in our tradition, reminding us of how the earth itself lives in us. And so too do the stories and histories of our people. They live in the air we breathe, the words we use. In the words of the closing stanza of the closing hymn today, our day is just beginning. We're always on the brink of becoming, of something new, of changing and morphing and reforming again. Ken Utner wrote this about Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was a martyr in El Salvador for preaching about the equality of the poor and working with the poor and for justice. When he was killed, Bishop Utner wrote, "It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. Nothing we do is complete, which is a way of saying that perfection always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives include everything. But this is what we are about. We plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything," he wrote, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something, to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way. An opportunity for grace to enter and to do the rest. We are workers, not master builders. We are prophets of a future not our own. We live in layers, different and complex layers, different harmonies and tunes, changing words and meanings and images, adjusting the recipe, reforming the dough, always reforming our lives, connecting us back to who we have been, from our many and varied stories, and drawing us forward to who we yet might be. The question is not what we can learn from the Reformation. The question is, in what ways am I reforming that which has been handed down to me? In what ways am I reforming that recipe that I'm now writing for myself, with not only every ingredient of this and that, but with every direction and time and temperature, every extra tip of handling and care? What is just now, with new words in some old tune, just now possible for the first time? What is just now on the brink of becoming for more justice and more love and more acceptance, of reforming a more beautiful world? What is just on the brink and about to be? Our hymn is "We Are the Earth, Upright and Proud," number 303. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and sing together.